Wow, as the Vice-Chancellor said, Liverpool royalty, thank you all. My first job is to invite the Vice-Chancellor of University of Liverpool, Dame Professor Janet Beer, to open our event. Can you please welcome her?
So, good morning, colleagues, friends, and a very warm welcome to this discussion of the continuing Renaissance of Liverpool. How did it happen, and what is its likely influence on other UK cities? This is a really exciting and important day, I hope, for all of us who have an interest in the success of our city region, and it's my honour to share it with such a distinguished audience. So thank you again for coming, and thank you particularly for coming to those who played such a major role in the city's Renaissance. And I would like especially to mention the contributions of Lord Mike Story, Peter Bounds, Alan Chape, Max Steinberg, and indeed those who are still responsible for taking the Renaissance even further, including Mayor Joe Anderson, the Chief Exec of the city, Tony Reeves, and the Chair and Chief Exec of the Local Enterprise Partnership, Mark. I can see I haven't seen Asif, but I'm sure he's with us in spirit. I'd also like personally to thank Lord Derby for coming today. I have to say that his devotion to both the city and the university has made my life possible over the last 4 years, and I'm very grateful. So what do we want to achieve today? The answer, I think, is in the title. We want to celebrate the Renaissance of Liverpool with those intimately involved, but we also want to understand how it happened, how far it's gone, how far there still is to go, and also what the more general messages from what's happened in Liverpool might be for the nation and for cities more generally. So we want to look back and celebrate, but also to look forward and make plans for the future of our city and other cities in the nation. So, and you knew this moment had to come. It is a game of two halves. In the first half, I'm going to leave it there with respect to the feelings of Evertonians in the audience. In the first half, we're going to concentrate on Liverpool, and in the second half, we're going to look at the wider national scene. You've already received, I hope, some interesting documents, and they're going to guide us through the various conversations. So, if the Renaissance of the city is the text for today, the sermon today, the crucial subtext, the informing spirit, is the contribution of the person who at national level has done most to inspire and facilitate the city's Renaissance, and that is Lord Heseltine. We were delighted to hold, a little while ago, an event in Liverpool which celebrated his contribution to the city and the nation, and we are delighted to be launching the proceedings at this event today. It is an important document, and it does mark the respect of so many of Lord Heseltine's peers from right across the nation, and we're going to hear more about that later, obviously, from Lord Heseltine himself. And if Lord Heseltine was in at the start, I'm pleased that the other Michael here today has been able to chronicle the consequences of many of Lord Heseltine's initiatives, as well as those of many others in the room and elsewhere. And I'm going to be talking a bit later with Michael about his book, his new book, Liverpool Beyond the Brink, about how Liverpool got here, where it's going next, and then, as I've said, we're going to turn to the wider national scene. And to help us do that, we have Dr. Andrew Carter, the Director of Centre for Cities, the leading think tank about cities in the UK. And Andrew contributed to our original Heseltine event and will reflect on the wider messages from Liverpool for the country. And finally, I'm delighted we also have today as our parliamentary sponsor, Lord Kerslake. Lord Kerslake has had a distinguished career in both cities and government, with core cities and as head of the civil service. And he is even more involved and influential in these spaces now that he's in the Lords, and continues to do really important work that's benefiting us in universities and all of us who live in cities. He's paying particular attention to the city-region agenda, to inequality and economic performance, and this was recently reflected in his Commission's UK 2070 report published last week. And Bob will be talking about that work later in the event. And of course we will be hearing from Lord Heseltine as he speaks of the future of the nation and its cities in these extraordinarily turbulent times. I think we will all agree there's no one better placed to do that. And so at this point I'm going to hand over to Lord Kerslake. Please welcome him.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for coming. I am absolutely delighted to be hosting this event, and when this Michael asked me to do it, I jumped at the chance, even though it's ended up being in the House of Commons rather than the House of Lords, because we were full in there. I think we are today recognising and celebrating the success of an extraordinary city, Liverpool, and the contribution of an extraordinary person in Lord Heseltine. This is a genuinely inspiring story in what has otherwise been, I think, a rather worrying and dispiriting time for this country. In my view, and I suspect of many in this room, Michael is one of the most significant post-war political leaders in this country of any political party. He is, for me, the embodiment of one nation conservatism. There was little or nothing to be gained for him politically in his involvement in Liverpool following the Toxteth riots in 1981, and I suspect an awful lot that he might have lost. The fact that nearly 40 years on we are still talking about his contribution is testimony to its power and its impact. And I have to say my admiration for Michael was considerable before Brexit, but has risen even more after it. His principled and courageous stand has come at a price, and put Michael at odds with many in his own party, but he has provided clear leadership for those who believe that this country is currently taking a dangerously wrong path and leaving the European Union. Now, as well as the report on Lord Heseltine's contribution, as we've heard, we have Michael's excellent, very readable book on the Liverpool Renaissance, Beyond the Brink. Now, I've worked with Liverpool as a city for nearly 20 years now, starting with the Core Cities Group, also doing a peer review when Peter was the Chief Executive, and I was actually Chief Executive of Sheffield City Council. So I've had, if you like, a close interest in what's happened in Liverpool. And it's not, as with all the cities, I guess, been a straight and even path. But that makes the achievements, I think, even more remarkable because of that. But as with all of our northern cities, the job is not yet complete. And in the second half of this game of two halves, we're going to talk about the future challenges as well. But for the moment, let's hear from Michael on the key messages from the Heseltine report. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And not to keep the metaphor going, but I was in Madrid on Saturday night, and very glad to be here to tell the tale. Thanks, Bob. I'm just going to set the context of our discussion for Liverpool, which is really about Michael Heseltine. I want to remind us about some of the key messages that emerged in the event we held in our great city a little while ago, which we've captured or tried to capture in this report, which I think you've all had. Because we're celebrating the Renaissance of Liverpool, we're really celebrating the contribution of Michael Heseltine. On that day, we talked about Michael as a statesman, a politician, a business person, but a city builder. I think it's the prism what he's done. We reflected on his empathy for Liverpool at a time when a very unsympathetic Conservative government wanted to close us down. We talked about his hugely critical contribution, as Bob already said, post-Toxteth, post-81, Merseyside Task Force, Albert Dock, Merseyside Development Corporation, Max Steinberg was here with us, and Eric Sargent talked about what he had achieved in that time. Those very difficult days. It's easy to forget how, frankly, dreadful it was, and along the blessed daughter Jessica, we did and still live in Toxteth. But as Max said in that line, he created beacons of hope around the city. And I think at that time, that was the most we could hope for. It was good. Mike Gagan, who was a senior civil servant, talked about Michael's contribution to urban policy more generally. And his line was, he changed urban regeneration in this country. Towns and cities up and down the country, not just Liverpool, should be grateful to him. We had the marvellous intervention from my dear friend who's here today, Lord John Prescott, who worried should he be on a platform with Michael Heseltine. He'd never been on a platform at Tory, I think, before. But he said he'd come to recognise how those two had come closer over their 50 years. He said, I'm not where I was 50 years ago. He wasn't. Liverpool and experience changes. And he said, as a consequence, I couldn't have come to Heseltine Mark I party, but for Heseltine Mark II party, I'm delighted to be here and proud to be here. We then had that marvellous offer from Lord Heseltine to Lord Prescott, which was when they formed the new party and the new government, of course, John be welcome to be Deputy Prime Minister. Enough of that. We also heard from Richard Leese, how he fixed Manchester after the bomb, the money they put in. He talked about Manchester City Challenge, which Michael started, the idea, laid the practice for the next 40 years for Manchester. He said Michael taught us a way of working with government. Most importantly, he said, in the 80s, Manchester was a dying city. It is now a great city, and, quote, that would not have happened, and certainly not in the way it did happen, without the contribution of Michael Heseltine. Our academics also paid tribute. Philip McCann on the European dimension. Andrew will speak later on devolution. And I thought Ed Cox, who's here today, said it very simply. There are many of us here today in our generation that have been personally inspired by Michael Heseltine to do the work we've done in our careers. And I think that's true for many of us. Sir Terry Lee, the self-made Scouser, said, look, working with Michael was brilliant. A business person looking at cities. He taught us to look for the next thing, and he taught us about global opportunities. This is not a small person we're talking about. This is a global figure. And finally, Mayor Joe Anderson, I'm delighted is with us today, said, yes, the contribution. Liverpool was proud to make Michael Heseltine a freedom of the city. As he said, Liverpool loved him then, they love him now. And one of the saddest things that happened in his life, one of the saddest things that Michael had never been leader of the Conservative Party or the Conservative Prime Minister, and I'm sure many of us in this room would agree with that. However, that's what we said. This is about Michael. I've asked him in his first contribution today, not to look to the future, but just to reflect on Liverpool, what he faced, what he did, what worked, but I think essentially I'm asking, what did Liverpool mean to him? So can you please welcome Michael Heseltine?
Well, this is all acutely embarrassing, well, I suppose it's very flattering, and I'm extremely grateful for what you, Janet, and you, Michael, and Bob have said. I'm only going to speak quite briefly because there are really just 2 points that I think are important in the story that we are discussing. The first, and this I disagree with Michael about, I went to Liverpool in 1979 as a Conservative Secretary of State to implement a Conservative agenda, the philosophy of which is completely consistent with what I believed then and largely believe today. I know that there was this ridiculous letter saying we should let Liverpool go hang. That played no part in any discussion in which I was a member, and I was a member of the Cabinet. It was a classic Treasury letter. They have them on file, sort of, any new idea, press button A, it's bad. And that was the letter. Geoffrey signed it. Geoffrey was very much the same, great friend of mine, very much the same view of myself. So the important thing which I'll come to in the second point that I want to make, which is about the riots, is that in 1979 I intervened on a massive scale. I was able to do it because Margaret overruled the Chancellor and the intellectual guru, Keith, on my side when I said we have got to do something about these vast derelict areas. Now, she may well have done it because she thought the Labour Party weren't up to doing it, or that she just wanted to stick it to them. But whatever it was, she overruled her two principal guys in favour of a Pipsqueak at the bottom of the cabinet. And so we did the Development Corporation, 600 acres. We did the Garden Festival, massive intervention of economic stimulus. It was supposed to be taking toxic land, greening it so it could be used for constructive purposes. I listed the Albert Dock, and perhaps most significant of all, I introduced partnership competitive bidding. Instead of the entitlement, you've got so many old people, you've got so many miles of road, you've got whatever it may be, therefore you get money. Here is the pot. You tell me what you'll add if I give you some of the money. And so that was pretty ruthless stuff. It had a profound effect on me because it worked. And not only did it work because the private sector had to say, OK, you clean that site, we'll put a house on it. So I got gearing, extra money. But it had something much more profound. Instead of shouting at each other, the planners, the politicians shouting abuse to the private sector, and the private sector returning in kind, they became friends. They worked together. They started thinking about constructive ways of doing things together that helped them, yes, but improved the city and all that went with it. So all of that was 79. The riots of 1981. I felt, because I had done those things, because I had taken on from the Labour outgoing Secretary of State, Peter Shaw, a partnership with Liverpool, I felt, I haven't done a very good job. I had lots of excuses, it takes time to show and all that sort of stuff, but I felt a personal responsibility. Step forward. Mrs. Thatcher, Margaret, I said, got a problem. Police, got to back the police. Of course we have. Law and order, absolutely fundamental to the vast majority of people in this country. But I'm not sure it's quite as simple as that. So I want to take 3 weeks off to walk the streets and listen. Margaret agreed. Massive intervention. You've always got to take these words with a pinch of salt. One thing for party audiences, quite another for the real world of politics. So I walked the streets of Liverpool, and the first few days was easy. What are you doing here, Secretary of State? Oh, I'm listening. I'm listening. You say we never come, here I am. Like Billy, I'm listening. It took about 3 or 4 days before some impertinent representative of the media said, well, you've been here 3 days, Secretary of State, what are you going to do? And I knew, of course, the game was up. There was no way out without answers. And so I produced a little list of about 30 projects that we were going to do. But the lesson of those 3 weeks, but indeed it was the lesson of 3 days, frankly, was seared on my soul. Everybody knew what was wrong. You were wrong, you were wrong, you were wrong, they were wrong, everyone else was wrong. Never me, of course. I'm right. And that was the problem with Liverpool. There was no leadership. There was absolutely no one prepared to stand up and say, follow me. No one who had any credibility in the local community. No industrialist, no politician. They were all there blaming somebody else. So I had a little list. And I spent 18 months every Thursday with my notebook, every page of which had a project on it, going through it and saying to my officials, Max Steinberg was there as a secondee, there were private sector secondees, how'd you get on? And they said, well, page 3, Secretary of State, we've done quite well, nothing there. Page 5, oh, well, now we have got a problem there. I said, what's the problem? They say, so-and-so. I said, how do we solve it? Friday, I set out to solve it and disappeared back till the following Thursday when we'd start all over again. Now, lots of exciting things came out of that. Wavertree Industrial Park, for example, was one. The Cathedral Precinct development had been stagnated for years. We managed to undo it. Groundwork was formed in St Helens. Business Link, well, it wasn't called Business Link, I think it was called Enterprise something in St Helens. It came out of it. All sorts of things came out of it. But the one that I want to just mention was Cantrell Farm. Now, looking around the audience, not everybody here is old enough to remember Cantrell Farm. But I will never forget Dick Lloyd, the Labour leader of Knowsley, who, during my 3 weeks, said to me, Secretary of State, you're doing a lot in Liverpool, but we've got problems in Knowsley, and come and look at Cantrell Farm. Well, it was appalling. It had a 30% occupancy, it was rat-infested, it was full of litter, it was a human slum by any other language. And he said, can you help? These things were so simple, my reply at the time, preposterous in its simplicity, but I was probably a pretty arrogant young man. I said, well, Dick, look, I'm prepared to try and help, but I want your assurance that if I come back with a politically doctrinal solution that you don't like the look of, because it's not in the little red book, you will not use your powers as a Labour authority to stop me. And his reply, I shall never forget it, he said, Michael, we have done everything we can, and we've not succeeded. I give you my assurance you will be given support. A couple of weeks later, I turned up, I said, Dick, we've got a solution. The Abbey National Building Society and Barclays Bank are going to buy Cantrell Farm. I mean, when I say it now, it is unbelievable. How much they lost, I hate to think. But anyway, I don't know how I persuaded them, but I did persuade them. And we put in a guy called Tom Barron, and the thing was a transformation in a relatively short period of time. Laurie Barrett, who was a very good property developer from the north of England, he started building private sector houses on the fringe, and it all worked. And to me, it is one of the most exciting pieces of social engineering, regeneration, whatever language you want to use, doesn't matter. It really worked. And of course, it was why I single it out as being so important, is because it was the basis on which I did City Challenge. And you've mentioned Richard Leese's comment about City Challenge, which I do rather share, in the decade of the 1990s, where the development we did in Liverpool in the 80s was very largely about derelict land. Cantrell Farm was about people. Derelict land is quite easy because there's no one there. But when you start applying the philosophy that I've described to you to people, then you hit very strong opposition for perfectly understandable reasons. If you've got 10,000 people living in an awful circumstance and you say we've got limited sums of money and I'm going to make local authorities compete and there will be losers, there is an outcry from people who say you can't do that. They're going to be losers. How can you have losers amongst deprived communities? I said, we're going to have losers because there will be winners and the losers will learn. So 10 won, 20 lost. And it was some guy I liked so much who was running Birmingham at the time, Birmingham's leader. Dick Knowles? Dick Knowles. It was Dick Knowles. Yes, wonderful man. And he lost, he did the presentation of the competition to me, and I asked questions, and I said, well, Dick, it's a very ambitious plan you've got here. What do the head teachers think about it? He said, oh, well, we'll tell them. At that stage, I said to myself, you've lost. It is precisely that attitude of we will tell them that City Challenge was absolutely not prepared to tolerate. It was about saying to the tenants and those people working with them or for them, what do you want? And you had to take the people with you. Anyway, Dick made a great fuss, but the second year he won, and because he'd learned that this was a lesson. So the City Challenge was about renovating derelict communities, awful housing, social conditions, all of that. But it made the local authorities work as a team, not in the silos of Whitehall, but as a team. And that all came out of that lesson. But then the last point that I would, of course, make, and I must, by this time I was completely wedded to the concept of an elected leader, of a mayor, the pattern internationally adopted by all our competing nations to drive growth and energy in the area. Not councillors elected for parts, looking down into their own constituencies, someone who has got to take a broad view, the whole community, and sees the potential to lead it. And therefore, Joe, I created Joe. I would never say that in public, because but it was one of the greatest moments, two of the greatest moments of my life, without any peradventure or doubt or hesitation. The first, when I sat with him in the mayoral chamber of Liverpool, and I said, Joe, this is coalitionitis gone mad. And then, of course, when he looked at me and said, Michael, we want to give you the freedom of the city. And for a Tory to be given the freedom of Liverpool by 69 Labour councillors is a treasure beyond price. Thank you.
We, on that particular moment of offering you the freedom of the city, Michael, I know you had a tear in your eye, and that was because I also remember when we had the Three Queens in the River Mersey, and you came out of the Cunard building, and we stood there, Lady Anne, yourself, myself, and people were cheering and shouting, and that, I know, was an emotional day for you too, because there were thousands of people streaming past shouting you. Look, there are a number of things that I can say, and it's also interesting that you're sitting next to Bob Kerslake, and for me, I've always been a huge fan of devolution, taking the regional devolution as well, but also the city mayors, and Bob played a huge part. I remember meeting you and talking about, we had the No Stone Unturned book that we'd done the stuff with Terry Leahy in Liverpool, and your point about, you know, what you did was just let us tell you what we needed, and you wrote it down, and that was important, because that meant that Liverpool and the region were deciding on what it needed for the future and how we were going to work. But the devolution agenda, and again, not many people know it, but I know that you had a huge influence on George Osborne, for instance, who was not a big fan of devolution. But Bob in particular, and yourself, for me, created what we have today, and that is the city mayors, but also devolution taking place, and that is something that I don't think a lot of people give credit to yourself, Michael, and to yourself. We just talked a little bit about the meeting with George Osborne and me saying to him, I can do business with you, but, you know, and the but was, and we've got to have this, we've got to have that, and it was that ability that the mayor or the leader with influence was able to extract from a government that wanted to see the basic principle of us being able to sustain the city moving forward. And I think we've moved real strides in the last 20 years. Mike's here, Mike Story and Mike David Henshaw, the European capital of culture, all of those things lit, if you like, the fuel. And we've continued to replenish the fuel and keep that rocket going. And there's much, much more to do. I like a lot of things Michael says in his book. Some things I will take exception to and challenge. But it is about the job's only half done. So we can sit here, we can praise yourself and Bob and all of the people. Peter Bounds is here as well, who played a substantial role in the regeneration. Max, you know, John, in terms of with City Challenge, we had single regeneration budgets after that with New Labour. We had £1 billion pumped into education, all of the things that seen standards rise in the city. So there's many people that should be thanked in this. But the most important for me to come out of the work that Michael's done and what we've said here today is that we've moved at great pace, at great speed, and done an amazing set of things, but we're only halfway through.
Thank you, Mayor. John Prescott, would you like just to chip in? Because I've got you on a platform with Michael Heseltine again. Go for it, John.
Yeah, well, I don't want to suggest I want to be a Deputy Prime Minister in view of the people running around at the moment.
That was his idea, not mine.
But Michael Heseltine is different. It's Mark II, not Mark I, and I'm glad he's Mark II now. It's about planning and intervention and getting together, partnership. I think that's where the thinking comes together. And Michael articulated it far different in Mark I than he is in Mark II. But his Mark II conversion made a change and encouraged changes that were needed in Liverpool. I sailed out of Liverpool 10 years on the Canard and the ships there. God blimey, they were blooming well stoning their own priests. It was difficult. It was black. What you converted in there, you gave them hope. I think that's absolutely right. But you showed them that you could do it. You showed that you would change your mind about how government has a role to play. Up to then, it was an ideological difference between the political parties. I think what you did, certainly on your own party side, is to recognise that planning and intervention is not an ideological difference. It's good common sense, how you get together to work in a partnership. Now, I'm sure I might be thrown out for saying such things against some of my own ideology, if you like. But what you've achieved is how do you actually convert systems from an old industrial revolution, if we're on the way to a new industrial revolution, where change is the biggest thing needed on climate change. And the North still got to get together in its full North. We're still stuck on the Pennines a bit. You won't be surprised that I should say that, but I welcome your speech in Leeds recently. Northern is the one. Accountability, which Bob's dealing with at the moment, is an important one. But you've made the change. You showed that you can have economic change, and you can do it in the interests of the community, a thing we almost seem to have forgotten a bit at the moment. So I'm pleased to come here today, even though I started off my contribution with, so what the hell am I here praising Heseltine for? But I did read the books. I found some change, and then the one I was actually quoting from, I said it arrived this morning. This was at that meeting in Liverpool, and I said that I don't know where it's come from, but there's a lot of common sense. And you then just whispered over to me on a platform. I sent it to you yesterday. It is change, and that's good to hear. A lot of people from Liverpool, that's a strong political base in Liverpool, with strong views and proud of their city. You've helped them a bit more, a bit more pride, and I'm certainly very happy to be endorsed with it, and congratulate all those in Liverpool doing it. Now can you come to Hull?
Thank you. Brilliant, John. Other colleagues may want to chip in later, but we have a lot to say, many voices today. So I think we'd like to move on now. I think my homework's going to be marked by the Vice-Chancellor. We're now going to talk about reflections on Liverpool beyond the brink. And I know Janet's got a few questions she thought me ask me, and I would do my best to answer them, see how we got on. I taught Chris Renard, he should be in the front row. He told me he got a 2-2, but well done. Mark Basner got a 2-1.
Yes, I mean, I think many of you in the audience will already have read the book. I think people in the audience will feel that they lived the book, and their family memory is different to Michael's, as Joe's already said in some places. But I have read the book, I learnt a lot. And one of the things that occurs to me, Michael, about the intervention you're making through the book is why now? Why is the right moment to publish this?
Thank you for that. It's complicated. I mean, I wrote Liverpool on the Brink in the 80s, the story of the collapse, and I didn't want to do Liverpool again. I thought I must work in other cities. but also it was too depressing. I said I wouldn't write about Liverpool until it became a good news story. And it's now entirely clear it is a good news story, whatever the footnotes, whatever the detail. I realised it was a good news story because before 2008 and the blessed Claire McColgan, I would appear on platforms and they'd say, we're very lucky, we've got Professor Parkinson with us. He comes from Liverpool, he knows all about failure. After 2008, immediately, it's marvellous we've got Parkinson here today, he comes from Liverpool, he knows all about success. So it seemed to me, this is the time to do it. There's a personal thing. I owe Liverpool. I came as a student in '62. It gave me my education, my family, my lovely Jo and Fran, and the beautiful Jess there. It gave me my career. I have the best job next to hers at university. It's fantastic. It gave me all the friends in this room, and it's lovely. And it gave me my team. As I stood in the Metropolitan Stadium on some Saturday night, I thought, what a city, what a people. Why would you ever not want to write about this? So that's why, and then frankly, you've forgotten this. A couple of years ago I said, listen, Vice-Chancellor, I could do X or Y, I could write a book. And she said, well, if you wrote a book, when people come to see the university, I could give it to them and they'd say, that's the story. Well, I did, and you can now decide it was good enough to give it to them. That's why.
Okay. I had no idea I was so, not guilty, but responsible in a positive way for this. But there must have been difficulties in writing it. There must have been testing moments.
Thank you. The Mayor's already said he hasn't agreed with me. I mean, the first problem is the Scousers. I love them to death, but they argue. They will not agree with whatever I say. I know that. I can only do my best. But same with argumentative. Everyone in this room has helped. Writing the book beforehand, afterwards. You know, this is a story that had to be written. I had the pen. I'm lucky. It's these people in the room which really tell the story. But it's the Scousers. Secondly, the same old story. Do you talk it up, do you talk it down? Are you Pollyanna, are you Eeyore? I've tried to be honest and fair. I have to say the only external reviewer said, this book is far too kind to Liverpool. And I thought, that'll do me. There's enough being unkind, frankly. You can't tell all the stories. It's a big place. I don't know a lot about it. But mainly, it was, well, what am I doing? What's the story? What's it about? And I realised I was writing it, because I didn't know when I started. It's about the remaking of a post-imperial city, which is global, connected, adventurous, trading in ideas and peoples and services, which collapsed and lost confidence and hope. And what we're now doing is not remaking an imperial city because we don't want to be one. We're remaking a global city. And we're on our way. We're not there yet, and Bob will tell us about the many challenges we face. But I thought, we're now doing economic placemaking. As we fixed all the bits, it was with a purpose. We're fixing that bit of the city, the waterfront, the city centre, Speak Garston. We're weaving a new economic narrative around the buildings because, as we've said, the buildings are lovely, but it is the people and the ideas. And I think that's what the book is about. And I'm now glad I know what it's about.
Yeah. So, speaking about the people, and obviously Lord Heseltine has talked about some key moments in the city's kind of twists and turns, the significant moments that made a difference. So what would you pick out? What would be the key moments and individuals?
Key people. In the 80s, or the end of the 80s, we were down, we had to normalise the city, regather and try and get going again. I think Peter Bounds, Alan Chape and Harry Rimmer helped normalise the city, and great credit to them. Also, actually, Sir Graham Davis, my first proper boss at the university, played a big part, and certainly Geoffrey Piper and Boom at those times pressing the story for the private sector. Tremendously important. That was phase one. The aspiring European city, I mean, this is really Lord Mike's story, David Henshaw, and what they all did. I mean, they really raised the bar, took us forward, and they're big things. And I think the third thing is what I call ambition in an age of austerity. Mayor Anderson has kept the show on the road. He has kept the ambition high. It has not been easy. But he's had friends. We've got developers. We've got Steve Parry and Jonathan Falkenham here weighing in, and a huge number of successful regeneration chief executives. I mean, Max Steinberg, Jim Gill, John Flamson, Bob Lane, Mark Basnick, Claire McColgan, Colin Sinclair, Bob Pointing, Ian Ray, all the people in one way or another contributed. So I think this is a collective story about Liverpool. We have the mayor, that's great, but this is a collective story, and I think we should recognise that. And of course, as I would say, the single person who got it going, and it's his legacy, is Michael Heseltine.
Future challenges, opportunities, strategy?
Lots of both. I'd be optimistic, I'd be confident. We've come a very long way in a short time. We know we've got a long way to go. Place, productivity and people are what we've got to do. In terms of place, we've got to ensure that the city centre we build remains quality and authentic and is the right kind of development. I think that's terribly important. Secondly, skills and productivity. I'm absolutely convinced, not just because Colin's here and you're the chair, that the Knowledge Quarter Liverpool has to be the driver of Liverpool and the city region more widely over the next decade, because that is the high value added things. I think those are the two opportunities really. The city centre is incredible. It will only improve as long as we keep our eye on quality and the right kind of developers in the right place. I think our big challenge, if I'm being honest, and it's in the book, is North Liverpool. We have not fixed North Liverpool. Everybody knows the figures on North Liverpool. Crime, poverty, blah, blah. The best bit of this book is about North Liverpool. It says, I know that. Why? Why did we not tackle it? And it tries to say why we didn't. No votes, febrile politics, short-termism. We fixed Speak Garston 20 years ago. A lot of money, a lot of capital. Why not North Liverpool? And it seems to me our challenge is, as a city centre grows and booms and becomes successful, and as Knowledge Quarter booms and becomes successful, and near North Liverpool pushes out, and Liverpool Waters and Stanley Dock and all of that, we should be saying in this room, in 20 years' time, North Liverpool will benefit. We cannot have me standing in the Estadio Metropolitana clapping the millionaires and the mayor saying it's worth 150 mil if some of that doesn't go to fix that area. And it seems to me our challenge and our opportunity, and I've said this to the mayor already and chief exec, no city can crack this. If we can be the first city that actually genuinely tries seriously to address social inclusion and tie it into growth, then I think we can be proud. So it seems to me that's actually what I think we should be concerned with.
So one of the things that Michael always does is to fulfil his KPIs for me every year. So we agree a set of key performance indicators, and there it is before you, the leading KPI, the production of the book. So I think he's just set his new agenda for his next PDR.
She's a very hard task mistress.
So the convening power of the University of Liverpool, which I hope is being demonstrated today, and I think we've got the major players in the room. We've got culture. We haven't got football because both clubs were going to be represented, but they've been summoned by the FA, and I can't compete with that. So culture, health, city region. Michael will tell me who he needs in the room, and that's what we'll do. So.
Thank you for that, Vice-Chancellor job. I just want to finish. I mean, the spirit we should tackle this problem, confident, enterprising, ambitious. The global city being remade, it's a better economy, better place, better people. Confidence, ambition, realism and honesty. Yeah? Raise our aspirations and our horizons. Liverpool does matter now for the right reasons, not for the wrong reasons. I finished Liverpool on the Brink by saying it was a Greek tragedy. The actors merely ensured that the city met its fate. And I think the difference is now the actors are writing a new story, and it is not a tragedy. I'm going to finish with one more line, if I may, Vice-Chancellor. It's a quote from Mark Basnett in the book, and it comes right back to Michael Heseltine. He said, the difference now is the following. Something Michael Heseltine had said. In the 1980s, when he came to Liverpool, everybody asked him, what are you going to do for me? And Michael says, when he comes to Liverpool now, everybody goes up and tells him what they're doing for themselves and for the city. And I think, frankly, that is the legacy of Michael Heseltine. Thanks. We have a lot to get through, and colleagues can say a little bit more in due course, but because I don't want to fall behind, I want to sort of switch this conversation now, if I may, from celebrating Liverpool, and we should, to where do cities stand, what are the bigger messages, and we're going to have 3 more contributions. Delighted, the first one will be from Dr. Andrew Carter, Director Centre for Cities, his reflections on what our story means for cities more generally.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a deep honour and very daunting to sit alongside and speak alongside many of your heroes. The work and the commitment that Lords Heseltine and Kerslake and actually Michael Parkinson have made over the many decades remain a way of driving what I personally am interested in, but more particularly the work of the Centre City. So I thank you very much for those sorts of things. I'm going to say very, very briefly, say something about this future of the city's agenda. And in order to do this, I'm actually going to take a quote from the book. And I think it's Michael's words rather than someone else's words. Because as always, you look for others that can say the things that you would ideally want to say, and they invariably do it much better than you. So this is the quote. The economic future of the UK is intimately tied up with the prospects and futures of our leading cities. If they don't work, the economy won't work, and we won't work. Their performance is also critical and crucial to the current attempts to rebalance the economy economically and spatially. Their success will be necessary if we are to compete with countries globally, since cities are becoming the drivers of national success in the 21st century. That essentially sums up the agenda, the city's agenda, brilliantly put, and doubly advantage that it's factually correct. Actually a rarity in many conversations today where people say things but actually they lack the facts to back them up. That is a factually correct statement about where we are. So it turns me to just share with you one of the concerns. I have many concerns. I'm Welsh. They come with a part and parcel of being Welsh. But one of my concerns, to share very briefly with you, is this kind of emerging and growing rhetoric that seems to suggest that the city's problem has been solved. In a sense, we've done cities. I've heard that being said to me in many, many differences. And now it's the turn of other places. Some say it's towns. Actually, some say it's villages. Some tell me it's the countryside as well, although what the countryside wants to do in terms of economic development, I'm always slightly less clear about. But this sense that the city's problem is over and done. I'm not going to go into the many, and there are many, problems with that statement and around this kind of rhetoric more generally. But it fundamentally misunderstands the role and contribution that cities make in the modern economy. Fundamentally misunderstands the role and contribution that cities make in the modern economy, such as the UK. And it also, we've heard this from Lord Heseltine and Michael, it fundamentally misunderstands the unfinished nature of the Renaissance that we are rightly celebrating when we think about places like Liverpool or Manchester or Birmingham. The notion that it is done is so far off the mark, it's laughable, but nevertheless this rhetoric takes hold and we should challenge it wherever we go. Lord Heseltine reminded us it wasn't that long ago, it was past 1979, or that might have been when the letter was drafted, when we were talking about places like Liverpool as places to be managed in their slow decline into something else that they once previously were. That wasn't such a long time ago. The Renaissance we support and we celebrate is very, very early in its re-emergence from a long period of decline, and we should never, ever forget that. And the work that Lord Heseltine, Lord Kerslake, and indeed Michael has done reminds us of that unfinished business. There is great strides that we have made, but there is an awful lot to be done. So now is precisely not the time to lose focus, not to do what we often do in Britain when we think about policy. Well, we've done that for a little while. Now let's move on to something else. Lord Kerslake will tell you about the 50-year perspective, the East German perspective. That is not a perspective that lends itself to 5 years, been there, done, move on. You have to be at this stuff for 50 years, 100 years. In fact, you have to be at this stuff forever in many respects. So it's not the time to lose focus and move elsewhere. In fact, the opposite is true. Now is the time to recommit, I think, to the city's agenda, and to recommit in a sense of being able to articulate the substantial investment that we're going to require again, and the substantial devolution that we've only just got started on to make our cities of the 21st century fit for what we ideally want them to be. So as kind of Michael says in various ways eloquently in the book throughout, if Liverpool and our other great cities don't succeed, then our country won't succeed. Thank you very much.
Now, I'm going to choose Lord Kerslake or Bob to me. He won't remember this. Come to this platform and take your duties. Yeah, well, he won't remember this because about 15 years ago, I tried to win a contract to do a study of some work in London, and I have to say on the other side of the table was this rather eminent civil servant, no, actually local government officer. And so I didn't win the contract to do that work, Bob, but I have forgiven you.
Oh, no. All right.
Seriously, Bob Kerslake has been a great man and a great spokesperson for cities for the last 20, 30 years. Sheffield, core cities, head of DCLG, head of the civil service, now in the Lords, and now really challenging the orthodoxy. And I think free from office is really, like Michael Heseltine, really speaking truth onto power. He did immediately say yes, he'd do it. I'm delighted he can act as our parliamentary sponsor. More importantly, he's still doing very powerful work, and I think the UK 2070 Commission report, which was launched last week, and you heard him on Radio 4, is a very important statement. And so I'm delighted that Bob Kerslake is now going to reflect on the future of the UK 2070. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much for your comments, and also for your comments, Andrew, as well. Now, we have today focused rightly, I think, on the achievements of Liverpool, but I don't think we would be the people we are if we didn't look forward and have an honest conversation about the challenges we face. As Michael said, we published our report last Thursday. It is the first report of the 2070 Commission. What is the Commission? Well, it's an independent group, and its purpose is to look at the deep-rooted spatial inequalities in this country. It goes back 50 years and it goes forward 50 years, hence the title. But we will, of course, make recommendations that are relevant to the here and now. On the Commission, we've got representatives from local government, from business, from academia, including Professor Ian Ray, who I should say is producing his own book later this month. I did promise him I'd get that plug in. And from the policy world as well. And we're supported by three great universities, Manchester, Sheffield and UCL, as well as the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy from the US. The conclusions of our report, if you have a look at it, make sobering reading. Firstly, on a comparison of the UK with 30 other OECD countries across a broad range of 28 indicators, the UK comes 28th in terms of inter-regional inequalities. That is kind of Eurovision Song Contest levels of poor performance, I have to say. Secondly, that despite the efforts of governments to tackle this gap, it has indeed grown wider. And there has been, in effect, a decoupling of the London economy from the rest of the country, so that the upturn in the UK, the London economy has not necessarily benefited other parts of the country. And thirdly, unless we take action to reduce this gap, and decisive action, it will continue to grow, so that London and the South East, based on some work done by Cambridge University, will take 50% of the jobs growth against 30% of the population. So the gap will continue to grow. Now, the consequences of this, I think, are threefold. Firstly, we do not take full advantage of the economic opportunities that the UK has to offer. Michael talked about the productivity challenge. We will continue, I think, to not deliver on that challenge. Secondly, it creates an imbalance of wealth and opportunity that in turn creates division. So to quote one statistic, a child from Hackney, a poor child from Hackney, is 3 times more likely to go to university than a child from a similarly disadvantaged background in Hartlepool. That's a huge imbalance of opportunity. And thirdly, here's the point, it creates enormous pressures and increasing pressures in terms of population growth, housing affordability and overloaded infrastructure and the environment, things like water, in the economically performing areas. So this is not an issue where the South wins and the North loses. Everybody loses if we don't tackle this imbalance. Now, in our report, we refer to a piece of work done by the ESRC Cities group, which Andrew is a member of. And what that shows is, despite the huge successes of our northern cities and the huge efforts that we've heard about, the truth is, the hard truth on the numbers, is that those cities that are pulling away from the UK average are essentially cities predominantly in the south. So even with all this effort, it's the southern cities that are pulling ahead. Now, I want to say this, it's not a counsel of despair, this report, far from it. We cite the example of Germany in the report and the unification of East and West Germany, which started from a much worse position and in fact went backwards in the immediate period following reunification. But through determined effort to rebalance and a significant amount of investment, they have made considerable progress. Not completed, but considerable progress towards creating a united country. If you contrast that with the UK, we are now more interregionally unequal than Germany was in 1995 in the immediate aftermath of reunification. That's an extraordinary statistic, isn't it, really, that we should face up to. But it isn't, as I said, mission impossible. And in our report, we put out a direction of radical change. Much greater devolution. Devolution deal we did, Joe, was great, but it has to go much, much further in my view. We have to harness the new economies as well as the local economies. It has to be about the MIT of the North and it has to be about the Preston Pound. It has to be about graphene and about Grimsby. It has to be about both things. Thirdly, we have to align our ambitions through a national spatial framework. It's amazing to me that most of Europe has spatial planning, but we don't in England, in this country. Scotland's on its 3rd spatial plan. We have nothing in this country. And fourthly, to establish a substantial UK renewal fund to invest in rebalancing. When we published our report, some people have said, well, there's huge subsidies going into the north from the south through tax. But that's not what we need. We need investment to shift the balance here. Now, the reaction to our report has been incredibly positive, with particularly strong coverage from the Financial Times, who are here today, and indeed from the Manchester Evening News, which did a really powerful spread. We're holding a symposium in Leeds next week, which Michael has very kindly agreed to speak at. We're having a series of events, and we're having another symposium in London in October. And our aim is to, in a sense, start a debate rather than finish it, to open up the debate for our second report in September and our final report in January. I think we had a really interesting time in British politics. We have the enormous uncertainty and risk of Brexit, but we do also have the opportunity to influence the debate on what is being called the post-Brexit renewal, whatever Brexit means. Bringing the country together again after what has been, I think, the most divisive period in my lifetime, really. And for me, a really important part of that is what is it that the big cities of this country need in order to do more? Because they can do a lot through their leadership themselves, but they can't do it alone. And we need national policies that back that up. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. This afternoon I'm writing the conclusions to the report that I've been invited to do by the 6 mayoral authorities and set out my proposals for the next steps. So this has been about as valuable a session as I could have had for that fascinating task. And curious enough, one thing came out of, I think, something Michael said that sums it all up. Why didn't we do North Liverpool? Let me ask the question again. Why did we do so much in the southeast of England and London? It is the same question. Scarce money. Money is always scarce. Where do you put it? Where you get the best, quickest returns. And so London, southeast, self-evidently, got great advantages. We don't need to list them, so build on it. The phrase was, once created, get on your bike. So move the whole lot to the southeast. Let the rest, economically less attractive, let them rot. Well, it is such a preposterous and immoral and unpolitical concept as to be dismissed with contempt. But you're left with the economic analysis, and that is what drives vast areas of political judgment. Scarce resources, where do you put the money? And over the years, as Bob has very eloquently revealed, it has gone to where it got the best returns. The government did it, the country did it, and you did it in Liverpool. And what a triumph. The South Bank, the North Bank of the Liverpool, both banks of the Mersey, what a triumph it all is. But what about North Liverpool? Now, the first thing you have then to confront is one very uncomfortable reality. You are going to take decisions which are less economically attractive than the competing ones which are to build on your success. It's called intervention. And there are large numbers of people who say that is the worst way to run, because it actually probably means you are less prosperous than if you had backed the winning streaks. But you may have a more balanced society, a fairer society, and for me the answer is you have got to take those decisions. So who takes those decisions? And this is where you hit the devolution agenda. And we are a seriously over-centralised and dominated by London country. And it's worse, because they don't even, and this is where Bob is onto a vital point, they don't see in the round the potential of an area, whether it's North Liverpool or whether it's Merseyside or whatever it is. They see transport, housing, social security, employment, skills, you name it, they're all through Whitehall, the departments. And that's where the career structures of the ministers are. It's where the career structures of the officials are. It's where the quangos have their drip feed of regular annual updates, whatever it may be. All thinking in blinkers. So devolution is about changing a culture and an economic analysis. And my golly, that is quite an agenda, and quite high profile and quite risk. And I can tell you, as someone who has had the privilege of being at the sharp end of it since the 1970s, when, of course, Redcliffe report looked at all these things, you're dealing with the greatest source of human strength. What I have, I hold. You're telling all sorts of people that they have to change and, worse, give up some of their power to share it or devolve it to somebody else. And that's not the way we think, it's not the way we behave, however rational and desirable and moral it may be. That's the politics of it. But again, I wholly agree with Bob. We have got to change the structures in order to unleash the energies and the local accountabilities and go back to the basic strengths of this country. London did not make this country, it was part of it, but the great cities reflected much more the inbuilt strengths, as today they still do. They may be different strengths, different technologies, different people, but they are actually essentially locally based, and you have to get back to that local inspiration. Set the people free is a phrase I've heard before. It applies economically, socially, intellectually, and that is the agenda upon which we have embarked. Thank you.
I'm just doing a little bit of rearranging of the stage because, just to share a secret, Lord Heseltine might have to take a significant phone call in the next 10 minutes, and so if he does leave the room, it's not an editorial comment, he's got some business to deal with. However, we have...
There could be a job in it for John, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, quite right, quite right. If Heza leaves, Preza will take over. Okay, lovely. That's been my... a real cornucopia of comments, reflections on Liverpool, cities, Brexit and all the rest of it. I think we have 10 or 15 minutes for colleagues, all of whom have sat attentively, all of whom have made a huge contribution in their different ways, nationally, locally, all of whom will continue to make that contribution. Thank you for coming. This is your moment and opportunity to make a comment, ask a question from whoever on the top table. We have roving microphones, and Flo Klukas at the back, and then Flo Klukas, former Liberal Democrat councillor in Liverpool, and I should have mentioned great Europeanist, and Stephen Jones as head of Cities and Local Growth Unit in Beige, and a very good thing indeed, even though he's with Joe's team, and then Joe. Please, Flo.
Thank you very much, Michael. The question I want to ask, I think, was touched on earlier when Lord Heseltine spoke, and that was the issue of short-termism. Because one of the things that I think made a really big impact in Liverpool early on was when the MDC had a 10-year lifespan. What I want to ask the panel, and frankly, Michael, I'll leave it up to you who to ask the question of, is how the blazes do we get government to see that short-term approaches from election to election actually are really counterproductive when we're looking at the sort of opportunities, the sort of challenges that have been outlined today?
Thank you. What I'll do, if I may, great question, Flo, is field several off and give colleagues a chance to think. So, Stephen Jones, I've got Stephen Jones, I've got Joe, I've got Louise Ellman, I've got Derek Long, and I've got Chris Murray, and I think that's probably the order we're going to do it. So, Stephen, off you go. Thank you.
I'll stand because...
Yes, please do.
Very high. So, as the probably only civil servant currently in the room, firstly, just wanted to sort of say that there are those of us keeping the flame alive from central government in terms of the stuff that Lord Kerslake and Lord Heseltine have championed from central government on the importance of devolution and regional policy. I want my sort of question a little bit is to draw that sort of North Liverpool sort of challenge and the kind of balance between it, the kind of where the rates of return might be versus where the kind of greatest need might be. And it kind of comes to a little bit, Andrew, and maybe interested to get your reflection back on that, in that there's a potential conflict with your point on we haven't finished the job in cities. And I sort of say this then in the kind of Liverpool context as a as a sort of child of witness, I was probably rare amongst my fellow Widnesians in that Liverpool felt very close, whether that was trips to the Albert Dock and the Garden Festival, or my dad going to work in and out of Liverpool each day, or more probably trips to Goodison Park pretty regularly. But most people, the culture of witness was Liverpool was a million miles away, and it wasn't part of that. And so how do we get into a kind of challenge between, if there is an emerging towns agenda, actually the solution might be the city nearby, but how do we balance between where you invest in the areas of real need, where the real levels of deprivation and poverty are, but how actually the kind of opportunities might not be in those locations? How do you square that circle?
Thank you, Stephen. Opportunity and need in a very pressing way. Mayor Joe, you wanted to say something?
I'm going to try and fit a question into this, but it's really comments about a number of things. And Andrew, it's a great sense of a city does stuff. But this is all about... one of the best things I think Ed Balls has ever done was go on Strictly Come Dance, and he'd done little else in his life in politics. But one of the phrases he did say, which I do agree with, is that you can't cut yourself out of austerity. And the bottom line is, we've had, whether it's the Liverpool Vision, which is an urban regeneration company, whether it was the MDC before, the government gave the powers and the resources for local intervention, and it was a recognition that local were able to do it better than national. And Bob, I say this to you because you wear two hats. Public sector reform is a way of investing but doing things differently. Forget about all the fact that we retain, fiscally, most over-centralised, but just public sector reform, the ability to change the justice system, the health system, how we operate in terms of cutting the benefit bill for housing by building more housing. All of those things need to be given to us in powers, in devolution, in the ability to change ourselves for the right reasons, economically and socially. However, it's a question to you, it's to Michael, because you are, who we look to, Mike Story, other people here, John, Louise, who are in the elected positions that you're in. How are we going to convince central government, given that we are just totally dominated by Brexit? Because devolution has paused. I believe we were moving places. I was quite optimistic about how the country was accepting the need for change, and it's like inertia, it's paused. How are we going to unlock that? I know you've got the report, but we need to be doing much more than that, and that includes core cities, second tier cities. How are we going to push this government? How are we going to push not just this government but politicians in this bubble to recognise the points that you make, that without the economic engines of cities, this country can't maximise its ability to actually generate wealth? How are we going to achieve that? And that's a question to yourselves, really.
Thank you, Joe. And can you just pass across, I'll take these questions, Dame Louise Ellman, indeed my constituency MP, has fought the good fight for a very long time and still at it. Well done.
I think that some of the key themes that have come from the contributions this morning are about the importance of strategies, public-private sectors working together, elected and non-elected people, and devolution. And in relation to devolution, I just like to ask a specific question. We're focused inevitably about devolution to cities. We're talking about the city today. But regions, much wider regions, are important as well. And in fact, in Liverpool, there's very little in Liverpool that hasn't also been supported by the work of the lamentably now defunct North West Regional Development Agency, which put money also into all the other major developments in Liverpool. And if we look at economic issues, which transport is key to a lot of that as well, investment in transport per head in London, at the last count I saw, I think about 3 times as much per head as it is in the north. And we're not going to solve problems like that without wider devolution than cities. So I'd like to know what the panel think about regional devolution as well, in wider regional bodies that can act as a real counterweight to what will inevitably happen in London, Wales, Ireland and elsewhere.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Some really gutsy stuff. No, it's Derek Long, Councillor Derek Long, leader of St Helens. Thank you.
Spurs supporter in the room, so we won't go into that.
You're all welcome. You're all welcome. Don't worry. You're welcome. You're welcome. You did well.
Thank you. Also, the token Woollyback as former leader of St Helens now, and I just struck through my professional and my political life over the last nearly 40 years now in Merseyside, the extent to which we were constantly running against the grain. The Housing Corporation, Max, was struggling to get money for a Merseyside Special Allowance. Mike was always making the arguments in the European Institute for additional resources, additional focus on cities. And so it strikes me that it's been a 40 years of struggle in many respects, enlivened only by great leaders like Mike Heseltine, John Prescott as well, taking out the baton at a national level. So my question really is, to what extent can we turn the exceptional occurrences where there are leaders who've made a difference, or exceptional acts of leadership at a local level which have made a difference, how can we make that the norm now? How can we make the regeneration, the focus on cities and towns regeneration as a prime focus for government, rather than just an add-on which occasionally happens now and again?
Thank you very much. And perhaps the final comment question in this round, and maybe the final one in general. Chris Murray is Director of Core Cities and a great colleague doing great work at that great institution.
Thanks, Michael. I think with devolution, by and large, we've done pretty well on the policy and the evidence, but not so well on culture change, as Lord Heseltine said. So what are the actions in the next phase of the debate on devolution that will impact on culture change?
Brilliant. This is a very erudite audience asking really quite tricky questions, and I'm happy the chair and don't have to come up with them. So Flo was on short-termism. Stephen was on that perennial opportunity versus need and place. Joe, I think, was on investing out of austerity and changing the central view of it. Louise was on really the old chestnut of cities versus regions, and I'm sure John Prescott has a very powerful view on that. Derek on normalising the regeneration, and that very powerful question at the end on Chris on changing the culture that will be needed if we're going to make devolution work. I wonder if I'll give Michael a go on those in case he gets his phone call. I mean, he can stay as long as he wishes, but in case you get a phone call, Michael, your thoughts on any or all of those, frankly?
Well, again, as I say, I am drafting a report on all this. And the easy thing in politics is to paint a glowing picture. It'll all be better than it has been. The truth is that my life started effectively in the House of Commons in 1966. There are no grounds whatsoever for optimism that the agenda we've all been talking about will proceed fast or smoothly. And I did flavour this in my last remarks when I said it's not the way human beings behave. And if you look at every turn and twist of those years in which I've been involved in this subject, the same old arguments have largely won and prevented advance. And so if I were to make a speech of optimism about it all changing and all happening faster, the sharper of you would say, well, that's wonderful, it's what we want to hear, but why do you think human beings are going to behave any different in the next 50 years the way they have in the last 50 years? And I can't give you a positive answer to that. There is only one answer that I can think of, and it's the one I believe in. We need a peasants' revolt. And you see, I don't even see signs of that. The subservience with which the provinces treat London, I find incredible. Now, if I was talking to the mayors, and obviously I've been very keen on seeing them come into power and existence, my advice to them would be, make yourself bloody difficult. Full stop, end of story. Get together and march psychologically on London. And don't do it on a party political basis, because frankly, if you want my own judgment, this is much, much bigger than party differences. I've worked with Labour leaders, with Tory leaders, Lib Dem leaders, I've worked with them all. And actually, in 999%, the party differences are very much for activist audiences who've got to be kept on side and have got absolutely nothing to do with the day-to-day job of running a great city. So get together and don't give in. You know, when you get the platitudinous answer, say, that is platitudes, please answer the question. So the Peasants' Revolt, if I may see of you and me, and I'm a peasant, absolute prototype peasant, you've got to behave like them. You've got to dig in. But how many people will do that in this country? Subservience, doff your cap, London knows, that's where the money comes from. Look, old boy, your career's at stake, you know.
Brilliant. Andrew, there were some specific questions to your good self?
A quick reflection. I mean, I think the short term is a good one, and it's often expressed. I suppose part of the story we've heard today is actually the folk of Liverpool have been at the Renaissance of Liverpool for an awful long time, and that, in a sense, is partly the answer that we are looking for. In a sense, to address the short-termism that we observe, which you can't really do very much about in terms of government. Lord Heseltine, by very definition, is an exception. His long-term commitment to a place is, by very definition, an exception, and we shouldn't expect that to be replicated more than once or twice. But we do see long-termism when we look at people like Joe and his colleagues, or the folk of Liverpool, which then leads us to a question about providing them with the resources and the powers and the responsibilities and central government support as they need it to make those long-term decisions that they need. And Joe makes an incredibly important point. It's not just about money. Money is very important. Liverpool has had a significant reduction in the amount of money spent in Liverpool over the last 10 years. We should not get away from that point at all. But part of the devolution agenda, the more significant part, is actually powers and resources to do things differently. And we know this. We know the magic comes when we integrate and coordinate and bring different aspects that are treated separately together. So transport meets welfare reform, meets housing, meets skills, meets employment support. Those are the things we see real change up and down the country. Cannot be done by central government. Not a criticism of central government, just a statement of fact. It's at the place level that we get long-termism and integration. And just very briefly, and leave others on this, Stephen's point is well put. I suppose a couple of reflections. Would we be in a position to deal with North Liverpool today if we hadn't done what we've done in Liverpool over the last 20 years? Mm-hmm. Right? I don't think so. Mm-hmm. I don't think so. We could have chosen to do North Liverpool 30 years ago. That's a different conversation. But the very question that we can answer now is we can deal with and help places like North Liverpool or North Manchester or parts of East London that we still see are very deprived and difficult, precisely because we've made hard decisions about investment, about public-private partnerships. So I think there's this either or is not the point, but sequencing and organising across time I think is very important. And the final part on that is that we've talked a lot about place, but the most important aspects of place which we miss are issues to do with skills and education. And we observe or we ignore those issues at our peril, in a sense of being able to reintegrate people and places back into economic areas, and to get the buoyancy or and to get the rewards and the opportunities that are going on in different places. Skills and education can never be understated. Never understated in terms of overstated in terms of the significance of those sorts of interventions.
Finally, perhaps a final reflection, Lord Kerslake.
Gosh, a lot to cover here, and I'll be as quick as I can, really. Flo's point about long-termism and short-termism is completely right, and there's a whole chapter in our report about the way in which we've seen constant policy churn in this country, institutional churn. We create RDAs, we get rid of them, and so on. You read the chapter, it's a sorry chapter, I'm afraid, that has undermined the effectiveness of what we've done. Contrast that with Germany again, 25 years, €1.5 trillion invested in the task. They've stuck at it basically. So I think you're completely right to say we need to find a set of policies and structures that can last the course. Not easy really. This issue of towns and cities that Stephen raised, I think it's an important one, but I think one of the most powerful pieces of work done for our commission was by Professor Philip McCann from Sheffield, which shows actually the differences between towns and cities are not great in terms of issues of disadvantage and deprivation. The big differences are between regions in this country, and regions that are geographically quite close. That's the extraordinary thing in this country. So it has to be about these wider regional imbalances and not turning it into a town v cities thing. The truth is, if the cities are more powerful and economically more prosperous, they have the firepower to help deliver the changes in the towns, really. That's the story that you can develop here, I think, on this. The third point was about the wider regions I was going to raise, that Louise raised. I personally think we need a new form of regional presence, regional authority. I would go for 4, potentially 5 in the country, building on the Northern Powerhouse and so on, not the 9 we had before. But we miss something. I don't know any other advanced country that's addressing this agenda that doesn't have some mid-level between national and local presence. You don't want to get it to do the local role, but it absolutely needs to do the national role. Devolution, gosh, how long could we spend on this? I think it comes from political moments, and we may be at a political moment where there is a big question about post-Brexit renewal, healing the divisions in this country that we've seen, as I mentioned earlier. One part of that has to be about tackling inequalities and disparities, and the only way I see it doing that is through devolution, really. How does it happen? It usually happens through political leadership, strong political leaders. John, the work that you did on regional RDAs, you just need someone in power who drives it through politically. Michael, we've heard about. George Osborne on the Northern Powerhouse, he literally drove that through government and made it impossible to resist, actually. Stephen is a shining example of a civil servant who's got it. I wish I could say the same for all of them. I can remember one senior civil servant saying to me when we were trying to negotiate the devolution deals, "This is all great, but I wouldn't want it to disrupt any of my national programmes." And some of the politicians, and I said, that's the point, really. You're not getting the point. But in the end, I'm an optimist. In the end, I think if we keep arguing the intellectual case, if we keep plugging into all parties, I don't mind who I talk to, really, to make the case here. I'll talk to Boris again if I need to make the arguments here.
You're just doing so well as well.
I used to work with him at one time. If we have to keep working on it, because the alternative is bad for everybody. Don't forget that point. The South East will face massive environmental and social problems unless we find a more balanced route towards growth. And we will miss out on the massive opportunities. The core cities point about 30 billion lost, really, from the northern regions alone in the lack of economic firepower there, really. So this is not an agenda that will go away. It'll get worse unless we tackle it.
Brilliant. That was some really very powerful reflections on some very good questions. Time is against us, happily. I don't have to contribute more. I'd just like to invite the Vice-Chancellor to finish our event. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you very much, Michael, and indeed thank you everyone who's contributed today on the panel and in the audience. As you all know, I'm reasonably new at this party, and so I have a very limited stock of Lord Heseltine stories. Max has the best ones, but you'll have to get him in a corner to get those out of him. It's a privilege for me to be part of the conversation and just to kind of hang around the edges of this. But some of you have heard me tell this before. I was walking with Lord Heseltine into the conference that gave rise to the publication early on the morning of the event, into the Maritime Museum, and a man wearing an NML, National Museums Liverpool t-shirt, was standing at the door waiting. And as Michael Heseltine approached, he said, "I've had a job for the last 27 years thanks to you." And Michael Heseltine said, "That's what we did it for." And I was already crying, because it was one of those moments. And I just looked at Lord Heseltine and I said, "That's not a bad way to start the day, is it?" And he just kind of went. So there we are. Thank you again to all our panellists. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.